doing, guys? Been a long time. What to navigate. There's so much stuff going on. There was something said by Noel Plum. I can't remember. It's Noel Plum, and there might be some numbers involved. Noel Plum is one of these users that goes back to like when I used to wet my beak in the YouTubes. The way he frameworked this thing was that he noticed that there's this upspike of people talking about, I suppose, the good, at least of the trappings, the Christian worldview, by way of the way it shapes human behavior. That it cattle shoots and turnstiles people in an appropriate way. The way he framed that is a last-ditch effort from evangelicals who have lost the intellectual argument. I think he's misreading what's actually happening. In fact, I do know what he's talking about. I've seen that argument surface in a lot of different cases. I've seen it surface in various interviews that the Rubin Report does, which, by the way, if you're not subscribed to the Rubin Report, by far he's doing the most interesting work in just overall macro discussions and keeping ideas alive in this cesspool of virtue signaling and all that is today's septic tank. Nonetheless, I do know what he's talking about. He's referring to a lot of quote-unquote skeptics or atheists leaning on, advocating for, borrowing, making a case for the infrastructure of the Judeo-Christian moral system, the Ten Commandments, how the fear of God plays into people's behavior, all this type of stuff. And the way that Noel seems to be hearing this is that this is a Hail Mary attempt to the end zone because evangelicals have just been so intellectually beaten back. A lot of wishful thinking there on Noel's part. Not surprising that he sees it through that lens. But the thing he's pointing out is true nonetheless. It is true that all these skeptics and all these atheists, and when I say all these, there's been an uptick in this. Some of which I used to watch for years, just berate the Christian worldview. And all these things are interesting to me because many of these intellectual cases I made right here on YouTube many, many years ago to the response of like a tsunami of what the atheist community did back then, which was just mock, berate, defame. Now, I think what's happening, this is my take on it, you've just seen the bottom fall out of the secularism that they were pushing for as like a stand-in for Judeo-Christian ethics. You know, be it the fact that Hollywood essentially is Sodom and Gomorrah, the fact that a lot of these ideas, like these quote-unquote liberal ideas, which really have just manifested into hardcore leftist Marxism, these are the very ideas now that are shutting down college campuses by way of speech, that are pushing us into voluntarily racially segregating ourselves. It's all coming from the left. So a lot of these quote-unquote skeptics or atheists are like, whoa, well, apparently that didn't work. We need to scramble for some sort of system or framework or authority, one might say, to ground, I suppose, ground or stake. You know, they're looking for some soil to drive something solid into because the buoy of secularism that was just drifting about in the oceans of new thinking or you know, reinventing the wheel. Religion is dead, God is dead. We think we've refuted that with science, none of which is true, by the way. This is the intellectual framework that they built up around themselves. What I think is happening is a lot of these users that somebody like Noel Plum is alluding to, what they're seeing is that didn't work. Bottom fell out. So now they're all searching for a way to move forward because a lot of these people are irrational and smart enough to know under the present circumstances, it'll just be a snake eating its own tail. I have begun to think that's somewhat of an inevitable end to this whole thing. I don't think you can put a lid on Pandora's box. It feels over reals until a lot of these people who are just desperately, you know, longing for traction again because they're living in an intellectual Mad Max world. I was always concerned about this. Even if I wasn't a Christian, I think, I mean, it's hard to get perspective on that kind of thing, but I think I would have been suspect to somebody who's like, you see this big pillar in the middle of the room? We don't like it. You know, some Sunday school teacher when we were a kid said something disrespectful, and religion soured like a Sour Patch Kid that I don't like in my mouth. So you see this pillar in the middle of the room right here that says Christianity on it? I'm going to go get myself a sledgehammer, and I'm just going to smash it to smithereens. I hate it. It's stupid. It's not science. So they proceeded to do that. People like myself, yeah, I have a vested interest as a Judeo-Christian advocator, but people like myself were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is more vital than you know. This pillar is supporting structural things within society, but not only within society, but within the mind, within our social order. Taking a crowbar to it because you personally have some anecdote or some axe to grind is not a sustainable, keeping with this analogy, is not a sustainable engineering decision. Well, they proceeded to do that in culture, in society, philosophically, I mean, you name it. And this porta potty that is our future right now is the result. They didn't replace it with anything. They didn't even bother to put up a couple 2x4s to support the whole thing while they were milly-nilly and reinventing the wheel in their audacity. They didn't even bother to do that. So sure enough, the bottom falls out the underbelly of this idiocy, which was on parade to see if you just skimmed history. I mean, the French Revolution is my favorite example of this. It was very similar. Secularists, they were the newcomers of all things that are great, and they were just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and reinvent everything, and it was going to be so much better. And they all ended up cutting each other's heads off. It ended up being a mad bloodbath of emotive ridiculousness. And that was all secularism, fingerprints of hardcore atheism and secularism all over that stuff. So it's not like this is the first time to the dance, but we're seeing that intellectually right now. And of course, a lot of the assessments that a lot of these secularists are making that Noel's alluding to, they're right. They're saying, look, where does this end us? If we stop communicating because these radical leftists now see speech as the same thing as punching someone in the face or physical violence. If we box ourselves in to such an extent that we can't communicate with each other, that everybody's a horrible name who isn't a leftist, if we do this to our future, it's going to end in violence. And of course it will. There's not three options. That's always the problem with leftism. There's not three options. There's two options. First option, we talk to each other. We put all the cards on the table. The best ideas win. The banquet of ideas, if you will. The republic that we now are all part of, if you're an American, in the past at least has signed on with this. Or you don't do that. You have this sort of tyrannical thought situation, or you create an environment in which to say anything that displeases the judge, jury, and verdict, that is what we can talk about, what we can say. They'll ruin you, destroy your career, destroy your family, sometimes take your life. Well, putting a lid on the pot like that, even though it might feel good, leftists have become very comfortable with doing that, by the way. We don't like it, so here's the lid. We don't want to deal with it, here's the lid. We don't think these ideas are worthy of discourse, here's the lid. We think even by allowing this person to speak, we're advocating for, or we think even if you sit down with somebody you disagree with, you're somehow correlated or somehow advocating for the same ideas. I mean, it's just childish things. I mean, an infant would be able to distinguish between these things. Their motto is always shut it down, squelch it on top of this boiling water. Well, that's not a sustainable option because violence will inevitably ensue. That pot will boil over. So it's not this third option. The lefts like to create this third option in their mind where they're like, out of sight, out of mind, nothing happens. So we don't have to engage those ideas that we think are so evil or violent or whatever, and it's not going to result in violence. That's not an option. That's not an option afforded to you. Anyway, Noel made a very, very interesting video in regards to this, although he and I are going to see things a little bit differently, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating question that he proposes, and I think it's extremely relevant. And since Noel, on some level, was potentially in the situation where he could contribute to the Breakfast Club, or at least I think that Got That Funk has some sort of previous relationship with him, there was a chance that he might be able to come and contribute, although Noel's channel is far more successful, and you guys all know how these things go. Who knows whether he's going to slum it. But, Noel posed this question, and I've had some dealings with Noel way back in the day when I actually had a channel on YouTube. So I decided to take a stab at it. That's shabby, and it's not as watertight as I'd like it to be, but it's essentially, getting the thing started. Let's hear what you guys think. Take it easy.